Hello, this is Chiak. We are back again with Dead Space Martyr. We're going to read part 3. I don't know if all of part 3, depending on how my throat is feeling with all the smoke from the wildfires coming in from the south. Otherwise, wanted to have a chat, I guess, about part 2, just because of the Dead Space lore. Part 2 made it seem like there were two forces at work, one against the marker or the marker itself, which which is like on one hand is either here's my thought. Either it's all just the marker and the thing is just creating conflict because it needs more bodies. Let's put it that way. and we legitimately have ghosts. So that's it's like I'm trying to remember the Dead Space lore. I'm like, I don't recall people are haunted, but then we always take it to be influenced by the marker itself, not ghosts. But either way, so I don't know if I'm going to get through all of part 3 today, but I'm hoping I will. So part 3, the Noose Titans. Okay. 22. How long has it been? Asked the colonel. Too long, said Tanner, his face drawn, his voice hoarse. Nearly 48 hours now. He'd been awake almost 2.5 full days. Most of that time he'd spent trying to get in touch with the F7. There had been a few scattered bits, moments when somehow everything aligned to let the signal through, and so he assumed there had been moments they'd seen him as well. But it never lasted long enough for them to communicate. And then, just when he was ready to give up hope, there had come a signal, broadcasting on all bands. They had gotten only bits of that too, but others had picked up other bits of it on other channels. Tanner's team had gathered as much as they could and were working to sequence it all together to form something. He thought they'd have something by now, which was why he contacted the colonel. But they were still working. Could they still be alive? The colonel asked. We already know one of them is dead. Hennessy? No, Dantec, said Tanner. He rubbed his eyes. He had a headache for days now, and maybe even weeks. He was starting to feel like he couldn't remember when he hadn't had one. That's a surprise, said the colonel. Tanner nodded. We still don't know what happened, but we know he's dead. He spun the holofile through the screen, watched the colonel tick it up on his end. Tanner knew what it was. A grisly image capture showing a disjointed torso propped in the command chair, its limbs piled neatly on the chair just in front of it. The head was broken and distorted and hardly human. It's a piece of one transmission that we were able to salvage. The last image we have, really. How do you know this is Dantec? Asked the colonel. The colonel was a hard man, Tanner thought. His voice was just as even as it had been before, like he was looking at somebody's wedding picture. Tanner circled portions of the image on his monitor. You can see here and there bits of hair. It's caked in blood, but we are reasonably certain it's hair. Ah, yes, said the colonel. Now I see. Hennessy was bald, Tanner said simply. The colonel leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. What happened? He asked. Tanner shrugged. Something went wrong, he said. Beyond that, I can't say. If you had to guess, what would you guess? Tanner sighed. Hennessy must have gone crazy and caught Dantec unawares. Maybe something wrong with the oxygen supply that had some effect on his brain. Maybe the pressure of being confined in such a small space for too long. Or maybe he was already insane and we didn't know. Doesn't it strike you as strange? Asked the colonel. Of course it strikes me as strange, said Tanner. It's not normal behavior. No, said the colonel. Yes, of course, all that is strange, but it's even stranger that happens now. Just now, when they're on their way towards an impossible object found in an impossible location. Sabotage, you think? I can't rule it out, said the colonel. Well, that's the least strange of the possibilities, Tanner. Show a little more imagination. He leaned forward again. Contact me immediately once you've got some footage to show me, he said, and reached out to cut the link. 23. The power of the signal, Altman realized, had increased sometime during the night. The indicator he'd installed was reading higher than he'd ever seen. The pulse ended and it fell back, still higher than it had been in its previous resting state. He glanced over at Field, who seemed immersed in his own calculations. Just to be safe, he angled his holoscreen so that there'd be no chance of Field seeing what was on it. He'd scroll back through the data log until he found the shift. There, sometime around 6 or 7 in the morning, though he'd have to do a full correlation to make sure. The signal's increase wasn't gradual, but immediate, as if something had suddenly and deliberately amplified it. He hadn't heard from Hammond since the night in the bar, which concerned him a little, but not too much. The security technician was probably lying low, being careful. When he wanted to get in touch, he would. In the meantime, it was up to Altman to find out what was going on. He logged his results into the encrypted database and then looked to see if they correlated with work done by the others. The others in this case being the 3 other scientists who had, like Altman, been intrigued by the gravity anomaly and the pulse and wanted to pursue it. Showalter, Ramirez, and Scud. Showalter, who had more powerful equipment than Altman's simple sensor, had gotten the same readings. At 6:38 a.m., there had been an extraordinarily strong pulse, followed by a shift in the signal patterning. The signal was now perpetually amplified. There were still high and low points, but the basic profile of the signal was stronger and had remained so ever since. Ramirez had noted something else, something that he had picked up off the satellite images while trying to get a sense of whether there had been a change in the condition of the crater itself. A freighter anchored about 15 miles southeast of the crater's center. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it, said Ramirez in the vid file he attached. But then I go back a day and it's still there. I go forward a day and it's still there too. If it's really a freighter, what would it be doing sitting in the same place? So yesterday morning, I hired a local man who called himself Captain. Okay, this is spelled like Jesus, but with some sort of marking over the U. Jesus? I'm not calling him Captain Jesus. I imagine it's not pronounced that way. You know what? I'm just going with Jesus, and someone else can correct me if they so choose. So yesterday morning, I hired a local man who called himself Captain Jesus to use his old motorboat to run me out for a closer look. I took a fishing pole with me. Once we were about 200 meters from the freighter, I had Captain Jesus stop and cast my line into the water. The captain told me I wasn't going to catch anything. When I asked why not, he gave me a long, hard look and pointed out to me that I hadn't bothered to put any bait on the end of my line. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Captain Jesus made a point of looking at the freighter and then looking back at me, and told me that it didn't seem like it was fish I wanted to catch, and that the kind of fishing I wanted would cost me extra. In the end, I had to promise to pay the good captain double his normal rate to stay there so that we could get a good look at the freighter. It didn't have any markings. Other than that, it seemed an ordinary enough freighter. except for the fact that it had a brand new heavy-duty submarine lift attached to its deck. That was all I had time to ascertain, Ramirez said. We've been there all 5 minutes, to which I spent bartering with Captain Jesus, when a launch appeared from the other side of the ship and pulled up alongside us, manned by 4 muscle-bound boys with military haircuts, but without the requisite military garb. Move along, one of them said. I'm fishing, I claimed. Fish somewhere else, he said. I was going to argue, but Captain Jesus threw the boat in gear and took us out. When I asked him why later, all he would say was, "These are not good men." Which left me with 3 questions, said Ramirez, concluding his vidlog. First, what use would a freighter, if it really is a freighter, have for a submarine? Second, what makes them want to keep other boats at a distance? Third, what the hell is really going on? What indeed? Wondered Altman. The last report from Scud, a laconic Swede, didn't arrive for another hour. It was a document instead of a vidlog. So sorry, his report read. Had to double check. What followed was a series of charts with captions in Swedish, none of which Altman knew how to read. After them, Scud had written insufficient data for certainty. For certainty of what? Wondered Altman. He tried to scroll down, but the report ended there. He checked the network and found that Scud was still logged into the system. Scud, he typed, please clarify the conclusion of your report. By insufficient data, I mean there is not enough data, he wrote. Without enough data, we cannot be certain. Altman sighed. Scud was a good scientist, but a little lacking in communication. What is your data concerning? He asked. Seismographic data, wrote Scud. And what were you trying to prove? Altman wrote. That the seismic disturbance was something generated by a machine rather than by ordinary seismological activity. What kind of machine? As I said in my note, wrote Scud, and then there was a long moment where the screen remained blank. Very sorry, he finally wrote. I see now I left it off my note. A drill. I do not have enough data to prove it, and maybe it is only ordinary seismic activity, but I think maybe somebody has been drilling, and maybe in the center of the crater. Altman immediately disconnected from the system and went outside to call Scud. The man seemed startled, a little confused, but after a while, he started to fill in the details in a way that Altman understood. Scud was drawing his readings from multiple seismographs, some on land, some underwater, several very close to the center of the crater itself. Only those near the center had noticed anything. The reading, Scud said, was something that would normally be dismissed as insufficient, very minor seismic activity. But it was also possible, he claimed, that it could be from a heavy industrial scale drill. It was very regular, he said, which would not be typical of a seismic event. But you're not sure if it's in the center of the crater. No, said Scud. Exactly, that is the problem. What else would it be if not the center? It might be as far as 50 meters from the center, said Scud. I have done calculations, but I'm afraid they are inconclusive. But that might as well be the center, said Altman, frustrated. No, you see, said Scud patiently. As I said, it might be as far as 50 meters from the center. That is not the center. Altman started to argue, then stopped, thanked him, and disconnected. He stayed there, looking out at the ocean a while, and then glanced inside to the window. Field was still keeping to his side of the room, talking on the telephone now, seeming no more and no less animated than earlier. Altman turned back to the ocean again. Slowly things were beginning to take shape in his mind. He wished that Hammond would get back in touch, since he'd been aware of it before anyone else. He might have a perspective that Altman and the others didn't have yet. In the meantime, it was up to them. There was nothing to say for certain that the pulse, the freighter, and the seismic readings were all connected. But then again, there was nothing to suggest that they weren't. And all three had something in common: the center of the crater. Something was going on down there. Maybe something had been discovered. Maybe it was some sort of weapon test. Maybe it was some incredibly uncommon but natural phenomenon. But something was happening. Something weird. Something that someone didn't want the public to know. Something that someone didn't want the public to know about. He swore he would find out what it was, even if it killed him. 24. I've got it now, said Tanner, his eyes red-rimmed, his face noticeably pale. He reached the limits of the anti-sleep medication. He had only an hour at most before either he collapsed or it started doing serious internal damage. Let's see it, said the colonel. I should warn you, Tanner began. I don't need any warnings, the colonel interrupted. Just play it. Tanner sent the file through the screen and opened it. It started to play. Tanner closed his eyes, but once the sound started, the dim hiss of static, the images flooded into his mind anyway, made worse by his imagination and his lack of sleep. He opened his eyes and looked. There wasn't much. The image had been broadcast through layers of rock, and it was, in a sense, surprising that anything had gotten through at all. Tanner wished that it hadn't. At first, there was only the sound of static, the image itself nothing but snow. Then little bits and pieces started to emerge. In terms of the images, it was as if the snow was taking on texture, a vaguely human face forming and then dissolving again. What looked like a hand, what could have been a fist around a pipe, or then again, been nothing at all. The sound went from a staticky hiss to a whisper, to something that sounded like a man was speaking through a mouthful of bees. Something that sounded like a scream, blood-curdling. A dull rhythm that might have been someone talking, someone singing, a wandering, meandering nursery rhyme. And then suddenly, a brief moment of clarity, a man's face, weirdly backlit and terrified, his skin covered with something quickly bursting into fuzz again. Freeze that, said the colonel. Tanner stopped the vid and spun it backward. The man's eyes had an emptiness to them. His features were strangely distorted, as if he were screaming. His face was covered with strange markings, symbols of some kind, which extended down his neck and chest and arms. Hennessy, what's he done to himself? Asked the colonel. What did he use to write? Blood, we think, said Tanner. You can see it dripping off his hand to the left there, and there seems to be a cut on his arm. Maybe it's his own blood, maybe Dantek's. If you look behind him, you'll see traces of the symbols on the walls as well, which, we assume, is also blood. The colonel furrowed his brow. What do the symbols mean? We don't know, said Tanner. Nobody has ever seen anything quite like them. When the colonel didn't say anything, Tanner asked, Shall we go on? The colonel waved his hand. All right, he said. Go on. More hissing, more static, more vague and distorted images. At one point, a brief glimpse of an arm that had been torn free of its socket, its lifeless hand curled up like a dead spider. A bit of the command chair splattered with blood. And then Hennessy was back, humming to himself, swaying slightly, covered with bloody symbols. Hello, he said, then dissolved again. He flickered in and out of existence, along with bits of word, nothing that could be sorted out. And then, something that sounded like shame, or maybe it was part of another word. And then, something E'd to know. On screen, Hennessy clutched his head and then was replaced by static, in color this time. When he reappeared, he was giving the camera a strangely ecstatic smile. Track. he said. There was a long silence. Simply not he said. Then a little later, not care, will have, le, us. Hard to make much sense of it, thought Tanner. But whatever it wasn't good. Then Hennessy was back again, with that same intense smile. He had moved closer to the camera, almost filling up the screen. Virgins, he said, and gestured off screen. Then he was still there, still talking, but little more than a ghost in the static. The sound completely lost until near the end he came back, the image almost clear now. Understand he said, then a microburst of static. Then destroy it. Hennessy moved out of the way, revealing in the command chair behind him the bits and pieces of Dantek's body. And then the vid ended. How many people have seen this? Asked the colonel. This particular version? 3 or 4 technicians, but it was generally broadcast, so a lot of people may have seen different bits of it. No way to say who has seen what. So no point killing the technicians then? Asked the colonel. Excuse me? Said Tanner. This is big, Tanner, said the colonel. Much bigger than you can even imagine. It's much more important than a life or two. There are billions of people on Earth. People are expendable, but this thing, whatever it is, this is the only one we've ever seen. Are you saying I'm expendable? Said Tanner slowly. The colonel gave him a shrewd look. Don't take this the wrong way, he said. At this point, you're less expendable than nearly anyone else. But yes, if the circumstances develop in the wrong way, you're expendable. Does that bother you? Yes, said Tanner. Then don't let the circumstances develop in the wrong way, the colonel said. He looked at his chronometer. I'll give you until morning. Find out how widely the vid is spreading and how much of it people have seen. Get some people on the ground who can ask the right questions without raising suspicions. Once we know where we stand, we'll figure out what to do next. 25. The call came around 1 a.m. Altman lay in bed, watching his phone buzz on the table beside the bed. Like a trapped insect. It buzzed and then stopped. He checked it, no number listed, and the hologram image was blocked. Almost immediately, it started buzzing again. It could be Hammond, he thought. I should answer it. Or Showalter, Ramirez, or Scud. But he just watched it buzz until it stopped. The third time, it woke up Ada. She yawned and stretched, her body arching. What time is it? She asked drowsily, and then she sat up in bed, tucking her hair behind her ear. Michael, aren't you going to answer that? He watched his hand reach out and flip his phone open, bringing it up to his ear. Hello, he said. Even to him, his voice sounded dry and crackly, as if he hadn't spoken for years. Is this, said the voice, and then paused. Michael Altman? Who is this? Asked Altman. The man on the other end of the line ignored the question. I have a simple question I need you to answer, he said. I'm curious if you've managed to pick up anything unusual lately. Intercepted something. Like what? He asked. I can see that you haven't, said the voice quickly. I'm sorry to have wasted your time. Do you mean a signal of some sort? He asked, thinking of the pulse. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Some sort of transmission? Said Altman. Maybe, said the voice slowly. Do you have something in mind? Who is this? Said Altman. That doesn't matter, said the voice. What kind of transmission are you talking about? He asked. A pulse of some kind? The voice suddenly turned nasty. You'll have to do better than that, Mr. Altman. it said, a harsh note to it. Wait, said Altman. Let's make a deal. If you tell me what you're looking for, I'll tell you if I come across it. The line went dead. What the hell was that about? Said Ada. I don't know, said Altman. Wish I did. Someone trying to pry something out of me. Like what? I don't know, he admitted. He got out of bed. He went into the bathroom and washed his face, stared at the man looking back at him from the mirror. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his eyelids puffy and swollen. He barely recognized himself. He hadn't been sleeping well. Bad dreams, and, on top of all that, all the excitement and fear associated with whatever was going on in the crater. Plus, a headache that seemed to go on and on. What if something had happened to Hammond? He wondered. What if they had killed him? What if they were coming after him now? No, that was crazy. There's no point being paranoid. It was just a phone call. He went into the other room, switched on the computer, connected to the secure server. Nothing new from the others since he'd last checked. What are you doing? Ada asked him. She was sitting up in bed again, hair falling partly over her face. I have to check on something, he said. It won't take long. Michael, she said, her voice stern now. I want to know exactly what's going on. You shouldn't keep secrets from me. You're not in trouble, are you? She asked. I don't think so, he said. If you were in trouble, you'd tell me, right? She said. I like to think I would, he said. What do you mean you'd like to think you would? What kind of answer is that? I mean, yes, of course I would. There, she said. That's better. She ran her fingers through her hair and twisted it so it fell behind her shoulders, then got up and went into the bathroom. He turned to the screen and quickly typed, Strange phone call this morning, just after 3 a.m., asking me if I intercepted something. Thought he was talking about the signal from the center of Chicxulub. But when I hinted at that, he rushed to get off the line. Maybe a transmission of some sort, but what? I don't know. Anybody else get the same call? He waited a minute staring at his screen until Ada came out and climbed back into bed. Then he logged out and shut the system down, climbing in next to her. Probably nothing, he told himself. You promised me you'd tell me, she said, sleepy again now. Yes, he said. A few minutes later, he realized she was asleep. He lay in bed, eyes open, staring up at the darkened ceiling. It was a long time before he was able to fall asleep as well. In the morning, logging on, he discovered all 3 of the others had the same call, all well after he had it. Ramirez first, then Showalter, then Scud, which suggested that maybe the person making the calls was simply moving alphabetically down the list. They were all as puzzled as he was. Ask around, Altman wrote back. Find out if other people had it. Find out if other people had it and what they make of it. By noon, they had the answer. Every scientist in Chicxulub they contacted had been called. Most of them had no idea what was going on, chalked it up to a crank call or the work of some paranoid. But Ramirez had finally talked to someone who seemed to know. He's talking about the vid broadcast, a man named Bennett said, a geologist and amateur radio enthusiast. I figured it out right away. He called all cryptic, fishing for something but not wanting to give away what. I said, you mean the vid broadcast? He pretended not to know what I was talking about, got me to describe it, then he thanked me very politely and hung up. Bennett had only part of the vid, A few brief seconds, something he'd come across broadcasting on not just one band, but several. And so, out of curiosity, he recorded it. There were about 3 seconds of static, followed by 5 slightly distorted seconds of someone talking, followed by 8 seconds of static. A few other people, said Bennett, had gotten other bits of it, and someone at Drago Corp seemed to be gathering copies of all the bits. Why? He didn't know. Bennett was pretty sure it was a hoax, somebody's idea of a joke. But how they got it to seem like it was being broadcast from the center of Chicxulub, he didn't know. Probably a transmitter on a boat, or it was broadcast from where? Somewhere near the center of Chicxulub crater, he said. All part of the hoax, I'm guessing. Can I have a copy? Why not? He had said. The more the merrier. He spun it over. It was a strange document. A man, naked, his body covered in symbols, written in a substance that seemed to be blood, staring with a strange grin into the camera. Understand it, he said. Destroy it. And then static. Altman watched it again. There wasn't much to it, for just a few seconds. Maybe Bennett was right and it was a hoax. But there was something about the man's expression, the tightness of his features, the dead, mad emptiness of his eyes, which made Altman feel that it was not. Where was he? He watched it again. It was a small, confined space. The walls, too, smeared with symbols written with the same substance as was smeared on the man. Something at one point cast a reddish glare under the man's chin when he bobbed forward. The lighting was industrial, harsh, and unfriendly. Understand it. Destroy it, the man said. Still working on understanding it, thought Altman. To be frank, I'm not even sure what it is. He leaned back in his chair, his elbows on the chair arms, his fingers tented in front of his face. Maybe a hoax, he thought, but maybe not. What if we take it all seriously? What if we try to pull it all together? What will we come up with? A signal from the center of the crater, something that hadn't been noticed before. A gravity anomaly, also something new. A suspicious freighter. Not exactly over the center of the crater, but not far from it. On the deck of the old freighter, a brand new industrial submarine hoist, and also military or ex-military personnel on board. Evidence of either seismic activity or of drilling, either in or very near the center of the undersea crater. A vid, sent out on multiple channels, apparently broadcast from the center of the crater. On it, a man in the confined space, apparently mad, covered in odd runes, saying, understand it, destroy it. They all seemed connected, and they all came back to the crater. Something happening at the heart of the crater that someone, probably Dredger Corp, since they were doing the asking, maybe others beside them, was very, very interested in. Interested enough to start a drilling operation, probably illegal, to try to see what it was or to try to remove it. That might also explain the vid fragments, Altman analyzed. What if the broadcast was from a submarine? He shivered slightly. The problem was that only raised bigger questions. He sighed. It'd be easier, he realized, to think of it as just a hoax and stop worrying about it. Only he couldn't think of it as just a hoax. The more he thought about it, the more he pondered it, the more he thought it must be real. He brooded, hesitating. Your move, Michael, he told himself. What would be the best way to flesh out the secret? In the middle of the afternoon, he hit upon an idea. It wasn't the best idea, but it had the beauty of being simple, and it was the only thing he could think of to have quick results. He put a copy of the vid onto his holopod and slipped it back into his pocket. Done for the day, he said to Field. The man looked over, his expression like that of a dead fish. It's only 2:30, he said. Altman shrugged. I have a few things to look into. Suit yourself, said Field, and turned back to his hollow screen. 15 minutes later, Altman had a hat pulled low over his face and was sitting in the lobby of the town's youth hostel, using its single ancient terminal, a pre-holoscreen model. The deskman cast him a lazy glance and then ignored him. He wasn't paid enough to care who used the computer. He spun the vid from his holopod to the terminal and then spent some time making sure he hadn't left a trail. Then he went on to FreeSpace and created a dummy account. It would be traced back to the monitor, he knew, but there was nothing he could do about it. It couldn't in any case be traced directly to him. He prepared a message. Draeger Corp's illegal doings in Chicxulub, he typed into the subject line, and then captioned the vid. Last words from a submarine tunnel deep into the heart of Chicxulub crater. He stayed for a minute thinking and then added, a retrieval mission gone wrong. He then proceeded to copy the vid to every scientist he could think of in Chicxulub, himself included, and to select few beyond. There, he thought. That should get their attention. That evening, he had told Ada what he had done, explained to her what they'd found out, what he thought it meant. He thought she'd tease him, tell him that he was making something out of nothing because he was bored. Instead, she just crossed her arms. You're such an idiot sometimes. Don't you realize it could be dangerous? She asked. Dangerous, he said. You think they tried to kill me for revealing some industrial secret? This isn't a spy movie, Ada. Maybe not, but you're acting like it is, she said. Secure website, gangs of scientists, secret subs, signals that shouldn't exist, and then this video. She shivered. A madman covered in symbols, drawn in blood. Doesn't that make you think it might be dangerous? What? How do you know what it is? She asked, shaking her hands at him. The thing at the heart of the crater might be dangerous, or the people who want to retrieve it might be dangerous, or both. But, he said, it's just, she said, and then stopped. She lowered her head and stared at the laptop. He watched her hug herself, as if she were cold. I don't want to see you hurt or dead, she said quietly. She was motionless for long enough that he thought the conversation was over. He was about to get up and get a beer when suddenly she started speaking again. You have all your data, she said in a very steady voice. You put it together and made it mean something. I might be wrong, he said. That's not what I'm getting at, she said. Just be quiet and listen, Michael. The scientists have only one way of looking at the world. I've got data of a sort, and I've got data of a sort too, and it's just as troubling. She started to lay it out for him, slowly weaving it together as if it were a story. The signal pulse began at a certain moment, she said, and from that moment on, everything was different. He knew it as well as she did. Do you remember when you started having bad dreams? I've always had bad dreams, he said, but not like these, she said. Bloody, apocalyptic, end of the world stuff every night. No, he admitted. Those are new. Everyone is having them, Michael. Even me. And I'm not normally prone to nightmares. She had noticed how distracted and ill-rested everyone seemed, from the townspeople to her colleagues. She was trained to notice things like that, so she started asking around. Did you sleep well last night? Did you have any dreams? Nobody was sleeping well. Nobody was dreaming anything but nightmares. And when she could get them to remember when the nightmare started, it always corresponded to when the signal pulse had begun. That's just a start, said Ada. Do you know how many times over the past week you told me that you had a headache? Dozens. Do you know how many times you've clutched your head and winced, but not said anything about it to me? Dozens more. And you're not the only one, she said. Everybody is having them. Before the signal pulse, hardly anyone was having them. Now everybody is. Coincidence? Maybe, but you have to admit it's strange. All right, he said. I admit it. Don't be a smartass, Michael, she said. This is serious. I spent months investigating the rituals and legends of this region. And before that, I spent years reading other people's reports on them. The thing about the legends is that they've been basically the same for hundreds of years. So, she reached out and cuffed the side of his head. I thought I told you not to be a smartass, she said, her dark eyes flashing. They're no longer the same. They changed drastically once the pulse symbol started. Shit, he said. The villagers are having nightmares, Michael, she said, just like us. But while our dreams are only the thematically similar, theirs are very specifically alike. They're all dreaming of the tale of the devil, which, as I mentioned the other day, is what the word Chicxulub means. Coincidence? Altman just shook his head. I don't understand it, he said. I've noticed here and there traces in the dust or freshly carved into the bark of trees, a crude symbol like two horns twisted together. When I asked what it was, people ignored me. When I kept asking, finally someone told me, almost spitting the word Chicxulub. She got up and went to the fridge, pouring herself a cup of distilled water. She drank it down and then poured another cupful, sat back down. She reached out and put her hand in his palm. He squeezed it. I don't know how it all fits together, nor how it meshes with your own data. Maybe it's all just weird coincidence, but all of it taken together makes me think that whatever is at the bottom of the crater is something that wishes us harm. You make it almost sound like a living thing, he said. I know it's not very scientific, she said. She took her hand back, rubbed her temple with it. Ah, another headache, she said, and gave a wry smile. After a moment, she went on. The people of the town seem to have a whole mythology about this tale of the devil. I don't know if the mythology has always been there or if it's something that's only recently developed. Certainly, I only started to notice it now. The only one I can get to talk about it in detail is the town drunk, and he talks only if I ply him with booze. He claims there are stories that have been passed down for generation to generation about a huge forked object thrust deep into the middle of the ocean. This, he told me, is a mix of Spanish and Acutec Maya. Is all that remains of a great devil who surrendered his dominion upon the earth to dig down to the depths and rule over hell. His tail got caught and is still there, perhaps still alive. Some believe that this devil may be attached to it. If you touch the tail, they say, you make yourself known to the devil. But the devil knows you. He will try to claim you. If you destroy more than you create, you make yourself known to the devil. You and your people, the drunk told me when he was deep in the cusp, you're known to the devil. And then he made the strange symbol at me, a kind of curse, twining his index and middle fingers together. She stopped and drank the rest of the water, leaving the cup on the table. After that, he refused to say more, she said. I tried to coax him to go on, offered to buy him more drinks, but he shook his head. He was finally admitted. He finally admitted, afraid that the devil might hear him. They sat silently for a moment, staring at each other. Maybe there's a logical explanation, said Altman. For the stories, for all of it. Maybe, said Ada, but I don't know. I could, I suppose, argue that these stories are an odd mixture of Maya and Christian belief, but if I dug deep enough and thought long and hard enough, I'd have a theory about how they developed. But there's still something there, a genuine warning and sense of fear that my heart tells me we should be listening to. I love you, Michael. Promise me you will at least try to listen. Okay. Just seeing how much more. Ooh, boy. I actually feel like I'm going to fall asleep as I'm reading this. I'm just super tired. That's all. Okay. Chapter, chapter 26, or just 26. We tracked down around a dozen or so people who saw the broadcast, said Tanner. He'd managed to get a few hours of sleep, though his head still ached and he felt like his eyes had been rubbed with sandpaper. Of those, about half got mostly static. The others got more. Of those, about half recorded it, but we knew that already as we used the recordings to augment our own. Besides you, the technicians in Dredger Corp, who else has seen the version you showed me? Nobody, said Tanner. I'm sure of it. The colonel furrowed his brow. Take a look at this. He spun the hollow file to Tanner. It was a communication sent from someone with the alias Watchdog. Dredger Corp's illegal doings in Chicxulub, the caption read. The body of the message consisted of a short bit of typed text. Last words from a submarine tunnel deep in the heart of Chicxulub crater. Retrieval mission gone wrong. In the vid. He opened the vid, saw Hennessy's blood-covered body and face, watched his strange smile and brief speech. Oh shit, he thought. The worst has finally happened. Who sent it? He asked. This copy was sent to Lenny Small, the colonel said. The list of other recipients is several pages long, mostly scientists in Chicxulub, but few others as well. That vid's originally from Sigmund Bennett, said Tanner. He recorded it. Do you think he's the one disseminating it? Tanner shook his head. He's not the type. One of my men talked to him. It was pretty clear he thought it was a hoax. He probably didn't even think twice about it. Probably just sent it to someone else because he thought it was interesting or weird. I'll have someone speak to him and find out who else he showed it to. Don't bother, said the colonel. Don't bother. What you said. Too many people have seen it already, he said. There's no point in killing anybody now. That's more likely to hurt than help. Tanner let out a deep breath. He was glad to know he wouldn't be asked to kill anybody. What do we do then? We come clean, said the colonel. We come clean? Tanner felt his stomach drop out. That's not what Dredger Corp does. Shouldn't we run this by Small? Small's not running the show, said the colonel. I am. This is a disaster, I'll tell you now, Tanner said, face flushing red. I'm not going down with the ship. I'm not willing to swallow the blame on this one. I'll fight it all the way. Calm down, Tanner, the colonel said. We don't actually come clean. We just pretend. If we release the story to the press, then we're the ones to spin it. We play it right and we'll be in better position than we were in before. How do we do that? Said Tanner. Simple, said the colonel. Call a press conference. Claim that you've seen the video that's been making the rounds and heard the rumors and that you thought it was time to set the story straight. You give the press all the footage you have and ask them to broadcast it. You're not losing much there, since a lot of people have seen bits and pieces of it. Anybody gets curious enough and they'll be able to put together a good chunk of it, just like you did. How does that help? What matters is what you say about it, said the colonel. You can't say that it's a hoax, because that just gives the conspiracy junkies fuel for their fire. So tell as much of the truth as you can without damaging us. How much is that? Colonel's lips tightened. You need me to spell it out for you? Where's your imagination, man? First, you say Hennessy went crazy. Not too hard a proposition to make stick once people see the vid. You say you brought him down to Chicxulub because you were interested in testing an experimental new bathyscaphe, a borer, a vessel that can, at least in theory, dig down through the rock while underwater. It's something which you're certain will change the future of undersea mining, assuming that you can get all the bugs worked out. God so far? Yes, said Tanner. Anyway, you chose Hennessy because of his experience with submarines and because he was a company man, someone who was reliable and who could keep a secret. Obviously, technology like this, the last thing you want is for information to be leaked. He came to test in Chicxulub. Why? Tanner thought for a moment. Because Chicxulub is out of the way, he offered. We have a little more privacy here than we might have had in other places, and it's possible here to test how bathyscaphe would respond boring through a variety of strata. Good enough for now, said the colonel. Polish it a little for your answer. I'll arrange for a few testing permits to be filed retroactively to cover us. So, you did a series of test runs along the coast in shallow water, with Hennessy and another experienced submarine pilot, Dantec. Everything went fine, no problem whatsoever. Then you decide, after consulting with President Small, that it was time to test the bathyscaphe in the deep water. What happened after that, you don't know for certain. When you asked the crew to prepare the craft for a dive, they informed you that it wasn't there. When you tried to find Dantec and Hennessy, they were missing as well. You concluded that they had taken the submarine without authorization, perhaps to steal it. You looked for it, but to no avail. It was either out of sonar range or they had their engines off. You started a search, you tried to contact them immediately, but there was never any response. The colonel's lips curled back in a way that showed his teeth. The next evidence of them you tell the press, was the transmission you intercepted. You don't know what happened, but it's clear that Hennessy came unhinged. You've managed to figure out the location of the sub. It's buried within the rock of the crater. So now you've contacted the military asking them for help retrieving the bathyscaphe. If they're able to retrieve it, you say that you're committed to letting the press know what happened inside in those last fatal hours. The military? Said Tanner. Is that wise? It's not only wise, it's brilliant. It gives us an excuse to change the scale of the operation. We don't have to work covertly anymore. But who do we contact? Said Tanner. Won't we end up losing the project to them? The colonel gave another predatory smile. You've already contacted them, he said, and pointed both thumbs at his own chest. You're already working with them. Taking some tea. 27. Altman had just sat down at the desk when there was a knock at the door. Are you expecting anyone? He asked Field. Field shook his head. Not that I know of. Do you want to get that, or should I? I don't mind, said Altman. He started for the door, then doubled back to log off the secure site. It came a third time just before he reached the door, louder and harder now. Outside were two men that he didn't recognize. Locals, he would guess. They were wearing ties and dark shoes that had been polished to a shine. One was tall and thin, with dark skin and a bristly black mustache. The other was clean shaven, his skin lighter. He held a smoldering cigarette tight between his thumb and forefinger, like it was a joint. He was sucking hard on it when Altman opened the door. Yes? Altman asked. We're looking for someone, said the man in Spanish. Miguel Altman. Michael Altman, said Altman. Can I ask why? You are him, perhaps? Said the taller man. Who's asking? Asked Altman. Who exactly are you? The second man sucked again on his cigarette, his cheeks shrinking in to make his face look cadaverous. We are asking, he said. He reached into his pocket and removed a badge. Police, he said. Has something happened to Ida? Altman asked, his heart thudding suddenly in his throat. May we come in? Asked the tall one. Altman opened the door wider, and they slid past him and inside. Field watched them curiously as they came in. Hello, Field, said the smoker. Hello, Officer Ramos, said Field. Do you have business with me? With your friend, said Ramos. Perhaps we could have a privacy for a moment? He's not my friend, said Field. We just share a lab. He stood and limped out the door. The tall policeman pulled over Field's chair and sat on it. Ramos leaned against the wall to Altman's desk. What's happened? Asked Altman, his panic over Ada growing stronger and stronger. Is she all right? It's nothing to do with your girlfriend. Do you know Charles Hammond? The tall man asked. His voice was flat and uninflected. He pronounced Charles as if it had two full syllables. Charles. The technician. I've met him. He says he's met him, Gallo, said Ramos. What do you think that means? The tall man, Gallo, ignored Ramos. How well did you know him? He asked Altman. Not very well, said Altman. We met once. He says they only met once, Gallo, said Ramos, and sucked on his cigarette again. What's this all about? Asked Altman. What indeed, said Ramos. Where did you meet him? Asked Gallo. In a bar, said Altman. Why? Altman hesitated. He had something he wanted to tell me. Sounds suspicious to me, Gallo, said Ramos. Which bar? How long were you there? Asked Gallo. Which of you is asking the questions? Asked Altman. You're confusing me. Just answer my question, said Gallo, same flat tone. And mine, said Ramos. Wait, said Altman. The bar was the one on the beach, near to here, and the cantina, you mean, said Ramos. There's a difference between a bar and cantina, you know. Cantina, then, said Altman. How long were you there? Asked Gallo again. I was getting to that, said Altman, his voice slightly higher now. He called me and asked me to meet him. You must have been there, I don't know, a few hours? How many is a few hours? Asked Ramos. I don't know, said Altman. 2, I guess. The bartender says 3, said Gallo. Well, he's probably right, said Altman. It probably was 3. And yet you said 2, said Ramos. It was just a guess, said Altman. How am I supposed to remember exactly? What's this all about anyway? Can't you get to the point? No, said Ramos, we can't. The point is, said Gallo, you were the last one to see Hammond alive. He's dead? Said Altman. He's dead, said Gallo. What happened? Asked Altman. That's what we're trying to find out, said Gallo. You don't think I did it, do you? Said Altman. You don't think I killed him? How did you know somebody killed him? Said Ramos. I didn't know, but I'm beginning to suspect, said Altman. He could have died of accidental or natural causes, said Ramos, but you jumped to the conclusion that he's been killed. Where did you and he go after leaving the bar? Asked Gallo. The cantina, said Ramos. After leaving the cantina, corrected Gallo. We didn't go anywhere. We shook hands on the street and I went home. I don't know where he went. Ullman watched the two police officers look at each other, exchanging a significant glance. What happened? Asked Ullman. How was he killed? Was Hammond your lover? What? No, of course not. Are you crazy? Why do you say of course not? Asked Gallos. I have a girlfriend, said Altman. What does that prove? Asked Ramos. Look, said Altman, why won't you tell me what happened? The two officers exchanged glances again. Was there anything unusual about Hammond's behavior? Asked Gallo. How the hell should I know if there was anything unusual about his behavior? I only met him once. I don't have anything to compare his behavior to. No need to get upset, said Ramos. No need to get excited. Throat, said Gallo, and drew his finger across his own throat. What? Said Altman. You asked how he died, said Gallo. He had his throat cut. He had a knife with him, said Ramos. Do you know whose prints were on it? Whose? Said Altman. No one's, said Gallo. The knife had been wiped clean. Do you think I did it? Said Altman. Why would I do it? How would we know? How would we know why? Said Ramos coolly. We don't even know what the two of you talked about. What did you talk about? Asked Gallo. This is crazy, said Altman. You think he might have been killed because of something we discussed? How can we know until you tell us what it is? How can we know until you tell us what it was? Asked Ramos. So Altman did. He took a deep breath and then began, best as he could remember, to recount the conversation they had had. When he said the name Dragocorp, he watched the two officers exchange glances again. As he spoke further, he watched as first Ramos and then Gallo crossed their arms. When Altman finished, Gallo stood up from the chair and said, Thank you, Mr. Altman. You've been very helpful. Ramos was already moving toward the door. Wait a minute, said Altman. That's it? What did you expect? Asked Ramos. That we were going to arrest you? We'll be back in touch if we need you, said Gallo. And then the two of them were gone. He called Ada to talk to her about it, but she didn't pick up. He still felt unsettled. His hands, he realized, were shaking. After a while, Field limped back in. Everything all right? He asked, eyebrows raised. Somebody I know was killed, Ullman said. Ah, said Field. That's terrible news. Am I in danger myself? Altman wondered. Did you hear the news? Asked Field. What news? Dredger Corp's announcement. I only just heard about it myself, said Field, when I was outside chatting, waiting for them to get done working you over. What was it about? You can get to it on the feed, said Field. Tap in and take a look. He logged into the news feed. There it was. Dredger Corp's news conference. He opened it up. William Tanner, the man's name was. Ullman didn't think he'd ever seen him before. There's been a lot of speculation about this strange vid clip, he said, and then showed a longer version of the clip that Bennett had shown Altman. I wish I could say it was a hoax, but I'm afraid I can't. In any case, gentlemen, I'm here to try to provide some clarity. He went on to recount a story about an experimental submarine with a drilling mechanism, which had been commandeered and then sunk deep into the heart of Chicxulub. They were calling on the military to help them retrieve the submarine. His delivery alternated between confident and nervous. At the end, he claimed that Dredger Corp is committed to finding out what went on in that submarine and why, and making sure it never happens again. Then, ignoring the reporters trying to question him, he strode quickly off the stage. Almond finished watching and then watched again. Definitely blood, he thought, upon seeing the extended vid fragment. He had to admit that what William Tanner was saying sounded plausible. It answered most of the questions he had. The only loose end it left were why the pilot had. It answered most of the questions he had. The only loose end it left were why the pilot had commandeered the submarine and taken it, though maybe it was enough to simply declare that to be madness. In any case, it sounded good. Indeed, it almost sounded too good to be true. Or am I trying to make something out of nothing? He wondered. Maybe he should just forget about it, let it go. One man was already dead, and he might end up dead too if he wasn't careful. Maybe Hammond had simply been killed in a mugging gone wrong, and it had nothing to do with the events in the Chicxulub crater. He thought it over, then went back and watched the press conference again. On one side of the scale were the claims the press conference had made. On the other was the pulse from the center of the crater. No matter how you looked at it, the pulse had started well before the incident with the submarine. The submarine hadn't started the pulse, but maybe whatever happened on board had been what had strengthened the signal. Maybe it was all a coincidence, or maybe it was a big mistake on his part. But he wasn't ready. He wasn't yet ready to give up. When he arrived home, Ada still wasn't there. He felt again the same brief thrill of panic he experienced when he thought earlier that something had happened to her. He tried to call her again. Still got no response. He waited nervously for her, 1 hour and then 2. He tried to call again, then again. Still no answer. What if something happened to her? He couldn't help but think, even though another part of his mind knew it was nonsense, that Ada often worked late, that there was no good reason yet to assume something was wrong. But then the door finally opened. He was close to hysteria. He started toward her, ready to berate her, when he saw she wasn't alone. She had somebody with her, a young boy. The boy was holding her hand delicately. He started to ask her where she'd been, but she silenced him with a look. Michael, she said, I'd like you to meet Chava. Almond looked down at the boy. He was young, either not yet or just barely a teenager. He was barefoot, wearing a threadbare but clean t-shirt and a pair of shorts hanging barely together. He was very thin. He had deep brown eyes and a slightly apprehensive look. Chava, Omen said. What sort of name is that? It's a nickname for Salvador, she said Ada quickly. When Altman gave her a look, she nodded. I know it doesn't sound like it, but it's true, she said. Really? He said, and turned to the boy. The boy nodded, but said nothing. Almond looked to Ada for help, for some clue as to what was going on. I thought you might like to talk to him, she said. Would you like to sit down? He asked Chava. The boy hesitated and then nodded. Almond pulled out a chair for him, and he climbed onto it. Would you like something to eat? Almond asked. The boy nodded again. Almond opened the fridge and started to look through it, then changed his mind. Come on, he said to the boy. Look in here. Take anything you want. The boy approached the fridge as if it were a trap. He carefully bent his head around the door and looked in, then looked up at Altman. Anything? He asked. Anything, said Altman. A few minutes later, he had most of the contents of the fridge piled on the table in front of him. He was tasting everything. He'd take a small bite of something, move it around in his mouth, swallow it, and then move on to the next item. "What would you like to talk about?" asked Altman once he was done. The boy shook his finger at him. "The lady," he said. "She is the one who said you wanted to speak with me." "Do you think you could tell him the same story you told me?" asked Ada. "This is not a story," Chava said with a frown. "It happened for real." "Yes, of course, Chava," said Ada quickly. "That's what I meant." "Okay, I will tell it," the boy said. "I was walking on the beach, very early morning. This was a day when in my head I thought, I will walk on the beach and turn to go to town, and then I will see if there is anyone who needs messages delivered. Sometimes you, the scientist, will give me a little money to deliver messages. Sometimes after 2 or 3 messages, it is enough to buy a polverone or regia at the Palastia. But this day my feet wanted to go the other way. I could not stop them, so instead of going into town, we went together out farther along the deserted beach. That is when I found something." "What did you find?" asked Altman. "I do not know," said the boy. "What do you mean you don't know?" "I mean that there is not a name for what I found. It was like a man, but it was not a man. It was also like a balloon, but it was not a balloon." "How can it be like both a man and a balloon?" asked Altman. "Yes," said the boy, and smiled. "This is exactly why I asked myself. I can see that you understand my story. The lady was good to bring me to tell it to you. It made a noise too, like this." The boy leaned over the table and began to make a strange wheezing sound. "The Busha told me to burn it, that it was a flea from the tail of the devil, Shikshulub." He crossed his middle and index fingers over each other and held his hand up for them to see. "But later, I found out she was dead." "How could she tell you if she was dead?" asked Altman. "It is like you are inside my head and seeing what I was asking myself," said the boy gleefully. Altman waited for the boy to go on, but he didn't say anything further. "You burnt it?" he said. "Yes," said the boy. "It burned very nice." "What part of it was like a balloon?" asked Altman. "Its back," said the boy without hesitation. There were the gray sacks. He touched a cucumber on the table they had taken a bite of. "May this come with me?" he asked. "Yes," said Altman. The cucumber disappeared into his clothes. He touched an onion and made a face. "Can I ask you something?" asked Altman. Chava nodded. "Would you take us there, to the place where you found it?" The boy looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you promise me that if you see me and you have a message to send, that you will choose me to send it?" "What?" asked Altman, startled. "Yes, of course." "This is good," said the boy. "And may I take 3 more things from the table, but not the onion?" Altman nodded, trying to hide his smile. Chava slipped 3 things into his shirt so quickly that Altman was not entirely sure what he had. "Now I will take you there," the boy said firmly. Okay, just seeing how... Okay, not too much left, it seems, because my voice is giving out. Haha, yay. Okay. 28. Tanner poured himself a glass of whiskey and fell back against the pillows. Finally, he was going to get a good night's sleep on a good bed. Between setting up the Chicxulub office, the arrangements to get the Bathyscaphe and Hennessy and Dantec to Mexico, the time spent on the freighter, the agonizing hours trying to figure out what was going on inside the Bathyscaphe, and all the worry afterward. It seemed like it had been months since he had had a decent night's sleep. He sipped his whiskey. The key, he told himself, was not to think about it. The key was to relax. It was all over now. The press conference was done. The next stages of the operation had not yet begun. His personal phone rang. He looked at it. If it was his wife, her name would come up. No name came up, which meant it could be President Small or maybe Terry, Tim, and Tom. They were the only ones who had his number except for Dantec. And Dantec was dead. "Hello?" he said. "William Tanner," said a mellifluous voice. "I have a few questions for you about Dr. Hennessy's death." "How did you get this number?" asked Tanner. "This is a private number." The man ignored him. Was there really no sign of an instability before the descent? Didn't Dredger Corp's safety procedures fail you in this case? Or should I say failed Hennessy and the late Mr. Dantec? Tanner clicked off. After a few seconds, the phone rang again. "Hello?" said Tanner. "Please don't hang up, Mr. Tanner. There are important ethical issues at..." He disconnected. He turned the telephone all the way off, left it sitting on his bedside table. If Small or the colonel wanted to get in touch, they'd have to contact him by vid. He took a big sip, felt the whiskey burn down his throat. He tried to relax, to empty his mind, to let himself go. He could relax now, he told himself. The phone was off. The door was locked. Finally, he could relax. But he couldn't relax. His head was throbbing, and something was gnawing at him. He got up and swallowed 3 sleeping pills, washing them down with whiskey. He stared at his face for a long moment in the mirror and then climbed back into the bed. The problem was that he agreed with the reporter. There were ethical issues at stake, things that had been done that, despite everything else he had done at Dredger Corp over the years, he was having difficulty living with. He'd been on operations where people had died before. He'd even been on operations when they died as a direct result of choices he had made. Not to mention the trauma of the moon skirmishes, where everyone had done terrible things, and where on more than one occasion he felt less than human. But these 2 had died, and he still didn't understand why. Was it because instead of corpses that he could see and make sense of, all he had were brief staticky images? Did he just need a little more finality? Or was it more than that? There had been no sign of instability in Hennessy before the descent. He ran over their interactions in his head again. In his mind, if anybody had been in danger of becoming unstable, it was Dantec. It was possible that Dantec had snapped first and that had made Hennessy snap. The whiskey and the sleeping pills were finally starting to take effect. Things had begun to blur. Maybe there would be answers when they brought the Bathyscaphe to the surface, he thought. Maybe that would explain everything. He was startled awake by the telephone ringing. He groped it off the nightstand and looked at the display. The name that came up was Dantec. His heart leapt into his throat, and he was suddenly wide awake. Dantec was dead. He couldn't be the one calling. He stared at the display. It still read Dantec. He sat up in bed, put his feet on the floor. "Hello," he said, facing the wall. "Who is this?" But there was only static on the other end of the line. He waited, feeling like he might pass out. "Dantec?" he said tentatively. "Are you alive?" He stayed with the receiver pressed to his ear, listening. At some point, he realized there wasn't even static. The phone wasn't even turned on. He put the phone back on the nightstand. Immediately, even though it wasn't on, it rang again. Dantek's name came up on the display. "Hello?" Tanner said. There was only silence. He put the phone back down again. When it rang this time, he just stayed there, watching it ring. "It's off," he tried to tell himself. "It can't be ringing." But the damn thing kept ringing. "Aren't you going to answer it?" said a voice from behind him, a voice he recognized. He felt the hairs bristle on the back of his neck. Very slowly he turned. There was a vague shape in the bed with him that, as he looked at it, slowly became human. Crude and awkward features became more and more refined until it was, at last, Dantek. His skin was very white, almost bloodless. His lips had turned blue. "You're not real," said Tanner. "Aren't I?" said Dantek. "Then why are you seeing me?" "But you died in the bathyscath." "Are you sure it was me?" asked Dantek. "Are you sure I was even in the bathyscath?" Tanner hesitated. "Are you still alive?" he asked. "I'm here, aren't I?" Tanner just shook his head. "Go ahead and touch me," said Dantek. "If I'm not real, you wouldn't be able to touch me." Tanner closed his eyes and reached out. At first he felt only the bed, the blanket. Then he reached a little farther and felt something different. Something that moved. Something alive. "It is you," said Tanner, smiling. "I can't believe it. How did you survive? What are you doing here?" "I've come to see you," said Dantek. "Can't a guy stop by to see an old friend?" "Sure," said Tanner. "Also." "What is it, Dantek? You can tell me." "I hate to ask, Tanner, but I need your help. I need something from you." "Anything," said Tanner. "What's mine is yours." "I'm having a hard time breathing," said Dantek. "I need you to share your oxygen tank with me." "How can I do that?" "Just make a slit in the breathing tube," said Dantek. "I'll cut mine off a few feet down, and then we'll splice them together. Then we can both breathe." I don't have a breathing tube," he had started to say, but then he reached up and felt it. There it was. "I don't have much longer," said Dantek. Indeed, his lips looked even bluer than they had looked just a few moments before. "I need something sharp," Tanner said. "Where can I find something sharp?" "There's a pocket knife in the drawer of the nightstand," said Dantek. "How do you know what's in my nightstand?" "I'm full of surprises," said Dantek, and smiled, his blue lips stretching and turning white. Tanner got the pocket knife out. And unfolded the biggest blade. "Where should I cut it?" he asked. "Anywhere," said Dantek, "as long as the cut's long enough. Remember, make it long." Tanner nodded. "Ready? Ready?" he asked. "Ready," said Dantek. He made a long horizontal cut, almost cutting the tube right in half. "All right," Tanner said. "Quickly, hand it to me." His voice sounded strange. Something wrong with his vocal cords. He coughed, spat blood. The blanket in front of him seemed covered in a pink mist. He looked down, saw that his chest was coursing with rivulets of blood. "You should have left it down there where it was safe," he heard Dantek say, his voice distant now. "You shouldn't have tried to understand it." "Quickly," he said, holding out his hand. "Dantek, understand what?" But Dantek was nowhere to be seen. The air kept hissing out of the breathing tube, and out into space. He tried to close the gap with his hand, but it was too deep. Air kept leaking out. His hands were sticky, his chest too, the hair on it all matted with blood. He tried to call out for Dantek again, but something was wrong with his throat. He could make only a gurgling sound. He tried to get out of bed, but everything seemed to be moving too slowly, as if he were underwater. Very slowly, he moved one foot and slid it to the edge and over, letting it fall to the ground. There was only the other foot to worry about now, and then he would stand up and go to the mirror and take a good hard look at himself and try to figure out where he had gone wrong. 29. The boy led the way confidently, despite the darkness. He had to stop several times, waiting impatiently for Altman and Ada to catch up. As they got close, Chava began chattering away, saying things difficult for Altman to interpret. "The Bruja," he said. "She was dead, but she helped us anyway. I went to find her, and she came with me and spoke to me and told me what to do. If she did not come, how was I to know what to do?" He looked at Altman, apparently expecting a response. "I don't know," said Altman, slightly out of breath from tramping through the sand in his shoes. This seemed to satisfy the boy. "But she did come, and she showed us what to do. A circle," he said, and nodded at Altman. "What do you mean, circle?" he asked Altman. The boy looked at him. Then he stopped and traced something in the sand. Altman shone the flashlight on it, saw a circle. "This is what I mean," the boy said, and then started walking again. Altman shook his head. The boy's way of thinking was so different than it was like communicating with someone from another world. Sorry, I read that wrong. The boy's way of thinking was so different that it was like communicating with someone from another world. Suddenly the boy stopped. He made the sign of the devil. He made the sign of the devil's tail with his entwined fingers and pointed. Altman raised the flashlight. There had been a fire there, its remains half buried in the sand. He waited for the boy to move forward, but the boy stayed where he was. So Altman stepped around him to take a closer look. Carefully, he pushed the sand aside with his foot. There were lots of half-burnt pieces of driftwood and char and ash. Then he realized that some of what he thought had been driftwood were in fact bones. They were human, or at least human-sized. But there was something wrong with them. They were oddly twisted and deformed. There were two leathery bits of something, skin or seaweed, he first thought, but as he looked closer, he was less sure. The texture was wrong. "Do you think fire could have done that to those bones?" he asked Ada. "I don't know," she said. He shook his head. Why was it that he kept on running up against things he didn't understand? Was it a problem with him or a problem with the world? He dug through ash and driftwood and bone until his foot unearthed the skull. It was blackened throughout, missing the jawbone. All the teeth were missing, though it seemed less like they'd fallen out than as if they'd never been there. The bottom edge of the melaxa was smooth, socketless. "It looked like a cross between a balloon and a man?" asked Ada. Chava nodded. "How was it sitting?" Chava thought for a moment and then kneeled in the sand, hunched over, hands near his side. "Its arms were becoming its legs," he said. "What do you mean by that?" "The skin was the same skin, and the flesh the same flesh." Maybe some sort of hideously deformed man, thought Altman. There was probably a logical explanation, but if it was a hideously deformed man, how had How did he manage to live for this long? He suddenly thought of something. Where was the balloon? He asked. Chava, still hunched, put his hand up by his neck and waved his fingers. How big was it? Asked Ada. Very big. Bigger than my arm? Asked Altman. Chava nodded. Bigger than my body? He nodded again. As big as a house? Chava hesitated, then nodded. Sometimes it was smaller, he said. But in the end, yes, I believe it was big as a house. Can you make any sense of this? Altman asked Ada after they had walked with the boy back to the edge of the shanty town and left him there. Not any more than you can, she said. You really think you think it really happened? I think something happened, said Ada. Whether it was exactly as Chava says is anybody's guess. It sounds impossible. But then again, a lot of weird things have been happening lately. I don't know what to think anymore. What about the others? Asked Altman. Have they been telling you the same story? They still won't talk about it with me, said Ada. I don't know why. I was really worried about you, Altman confessed. Once the boys started talking, I had to keep going. Once the boys started talking, I had to keep going, she said. Any interruptions might have spooked him. Altman nodded. They walked a little further. The footsteps softened the dust of the road. You know that guy I talked to at the bar? Yes, she said. What about him? He's dead. She stopped. Dead? She said. What happened? His throat was slit. She grabbed his arm, jerked it until he looked at her. You see, she said, I told you it was dangerous, and now somebody's dead. It's probably nothing, he said. Probably just a mugging. He saw a flicker of hope pass through her eyes and quickly fade. But what if it's not? You should give this up. You should stop your game of spying and do the job you were sent down here to do. He didn't say anything, just tried to tug his arm away. Promise me, Michael, she said. Promise me. I can't, he said. Why not? Look, he said, taking her by the shoulders. You were the one who brought Chava to me. I didn't ask you to do that. But every new thing I hear makes it seem stranger and stranger. I need to figure out what's going on. At first, she was very angry. She started walking, fast, staying out in front of him, and wouldn't look back. He followed her, calling her name. Gradually, she slowed down a little, finally let him take her hand, but still wouldn't look at him. He pulled her close and held her while she tried to push him away, very gradually giving in. You don't love me enough to do this for me, she tried. I do love you, he said. That's not what this is about. She pouted. Finally, she put her arms around his neck. I don't want to lose you, Michael, she said. You won't lose me, he said. I promise. They walked slowly down the street. They passed an open door, a makeshift wooden sign hanging over it reading Bar de Primera Categoria. Another sign beside it, this one cardboard, reading Bebedas Muabartas. They were already 20 feet past when Altman stopped and doubled back. Where are you going now? Asked Ada. I need a drink, he said. I need to raise a glass to Hammond. He pushed open the door. The patrons, all locals, looked up, fell immediately silent. He went up to the counter, which consisted of a stack of old crates, and ordered a beer for himself, one for Ada. When the beers came, he looked around for a place to sit. There was nowhere. All the tables were full and people were leaning against the wall. He paid the bartender and then carried their drinks outside. They sat on the edge of the dusty street before the makeshift bar. In the light coming through the half-open door, backs against the rickety wall, and drank their beers. "It worries me," he said, putting his beer down. "What?" "This," he said. "All of it. The thing going on in Chicxulub, the pulse, the submarine, the stories you're hearing, the dreams everyone has been having, the thing we just saw on the beach. I think we're in trouble." "You and I?" "Everybody," he said. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid." "All the more reason to leave it alone," she mumbled. He ignored her. He groped for his beer, but suddenly he couldn't find it. He turned and looked for it, but it was gone. He turned on the flashlight and shone it into the shadows on the edge of the building. A little farther away from the door, there was a man there, his shirt and his clothes filthy. He was obviously very drunk. He was holding Altman's bottle to his lips, rapidly emptying it. "That drunk just took my beer," he said to Ada, a little astonished. The man finished the beer, smacked his lips, and tossed the bottle off into the darkness. Then he looked at them, squinting into the beam of the flashlight. Altman lowered it a little bit. The man held out his hand, snapped his fingers. Altman grinned. "I think he wants your beer too," he said. Ada spoke to him softly in Spanish, and the man nodded. She held out her beer, and the man took it eagerly and upended it, quickly downed it. He tossed the bottle away, then leaned back against the wall. "Hello," said Altman. The man carefully smoothed his filthy shirt. "Mucho gusto," he said. His accent and cadence were surprisingly formal. He redirected his gaze toward Ada, inclined his head slightly. "Encantando," he said. "We've met before," said Ada. "You told me your stories, don't you remember?" The man looked at her with his watery eyes, but did not answer. After a long moment, he leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. He stayed like that for long enough that Altman wondered if he hadn't fallen asleep. Suddenly, he asked in Spanish, "What are your names?" "Michael Altman," said Altman. "This is my girlfriend, Ada Cortez. What is your name?" The man ignored the question. "Thank you for the drinks," he said, his Spanish excessively polite. He turned to Ada. "Cortez, a good, vigorous Spanish name, but not one my people care for reasons that you must know. We have a very long memory. You must not hold it against us." Ada nodded. "Ada, from Hebrew, meaning adornment. It is a lovely name for a woman as beautiful as you. Centuries ago, it was the name of the daughter of a notorious and handsome club-footed poet, and a century or more later, the name too of a book by a famous writer." "How do you know this?" asked Ada. "Names were a hobby of mine," the man said, "before drinking became my only hobby." He turned back to Altman. "Michael, the name of the archangel on God's right hand. Are you a religious man, Michael?" "No," said Altman. "I am not." "Then we shall refer to you not as Michael, but as Altman. The name Altman is German, is it not?" "Yes," said Altman, "but I'm from the North American sector." "You do not have a German face," the man said. "I hope it does not offend you that I say this. What places are there in you?" "I'm a mongrel," said Altman evasively. "A mix of everything." "I can see from your face that you are one of us as well," said the drunk. "The devil thinks he knows you, but he does not know all of you." "My mother was part Indian," Altman admitted. "I don't know what tribe." "I would say she was of our tribe," said the drunk. "I don't know," said Altman. "What?" said Ada. "Your mother was part Indian?" You never told me that before. She didn't like to talk about it, said Altman. I don't know why. I don't think about it often. Are you here for a reason? The man said. I came here with Ada, said Altman. That may very well be, said the man, but that is not the reason. And what is the reason? The man smiled. Your name, he said. Altman. Alt, meaning old. Man, with two N's, meaning man. You are not an old man. You are a young man. Can you explain this to me? It's just a name, said Altman. You understand the importance of a name only once you have lost yours, as I have. He leaned his head back against the wall, closed his eyes. There is perhaps another meaning, he said. Alt could mean ancient, but that is not so different from old. Altman might be an old man or an old servant, or, if I'm not taking too many liberties, a wise man. He opened his eyes again, gave Altman an intense stare, his eyes glittering in the crosslight from the flash beam. Which one shall it be for you? They sat in silence. Again, Altman thought the drunk had fallen asleep. Ready to go? He asked Ada. If you buy me another drink, said the drunk quietly, I will tell you what I know. About what? Asked Altman. About the thing you have been asking of all over the town. He crossed his fingers. About the tale of the devil. Here we are, said the old man, sipping his drink, living on the edge of the place where the devil dug down to hell, leaving only its tail behind. Perhaps you do not believe this to be true, he said. You, Altman, are no believer, but I have come to tell you that it is we, it is you and I and other Yucatec Maya who have been called to watch over the devil and to drive him back to hell whenever he appears. This is not the only body burned on the beach. My father told me of others. He had not seen them, and his grandfather had not seen them, and his great-grandfather had not seen them. But perhaps his great-great-grandfather had, or if not him, some ancestor before. There is a clock ticking within the devil's tail, a clock that measures the hours in its own way and judges us accordingly. When the hour is ready, the devil's tail awakens. Its curse sends our dead back onto our shores and into our heads. We destroy the messengers on the shore and plead with those in our heads to put the tail back asleep. We are not ready to listen to it. We do not talk of this with strangers, but you are only partly a stranger, so perhaps it is not wrong to talk to you. And I myself have become a man with no name, so it no longer matters what I do or whom I tell. For how can I be punished if I do not have a name? When I heard your name and in it heard that you were a wise man, I told myself I would speak. I saw the creature with my own eyes. Had I a name and children, I would tell my name to them and have them memorize it, just as my father had me do, so they could tell their own children and their children's children. Such is the way we learn and understand. Such is the way we remember. I saw the creature with my own eyes. It was like a man, but it was not a man. Where a man would have had separate legs and arms, its legs had joined with its arms, and there was no parting them. Where a man would have a face, this creature had a hole. Where a man would have a cage of ribs to frame him, the ribs of this creature's back had opened and curled upon themselves in a scroll. Where a man has lungs that obey him and keep the same shape and form, the creature had lungs that kept swelling and swelling, rising from its back like nothing so much as an inflating balloon. How can this be? It is not the same creature that my father told me of and made me memorize, but another. Bodies do not do what this creature did, and when it breathed air in, the air it breathed out was not the same. Air had been bled of its life and became nauseous and sick, stinking and choking. The rituals associated with the appearance of the devil or his minions, ways of driving the devil out. There are forgotten languages that can be spoken and that are remembered in time of need. The dead come whispering in our ears. This time it was a boy who led us, a boy who understood what he was doing almost not at all. There are dances and measured steps that one can take to contain the darkness. Each stage of the dance is a stage of the development of life, and as we dance the development of life, the creature becomes caught in them and becomes vulnerable. When it is tight in the trap, then we destroy it. But there is one thing that I saw about this creature that I would not put in the stories, that I would not tell to my children, did I have them. And for this reason, I cannot bring myself to dance with the others. One thing I saw that I cannot make fit with the stories I have heard, in which I can only drive away by telling it to you. There, on what would be its arm, were it human, was a tattoo. It was a tattoo I had seen before, in a bar a few weeks before, on the arm of a sailor sitting at the bar beside me. In his cup he showed me his tattoo. The image of a woman riding a wave. The sun cupped in her hand, the workmanship very fine. The next day he was gone, shipped out, and then his tattoo appeared on the creature that we burned on the beach. Now tell me this, Altman. Tell me this, wise man, if this is what you are and not an old servant instead. Was the tattoo there because the creature, through a power known only to itself, had stolen it? Or was the tattoo there because the creature had not always been a creature? Was the tattoo there because the creature had once been a man? On the way home, his arm wrapped protectively around Ada's shoulder, both of them silent. He felt like there was too much moving around in his head, too much to consider. He tried to tell himself that he didn't believe the old man's story. There was simply a fantasy, but he had seen the remains. He simultaneously couldn't believe and couldn't not believe, which made him feel like he was carrying a whole heavy, indecipherable world in his head. He needed to do something, to forget about this entirely or do something. Back at the house, after he got ready for bed and was waiting for Ada to come out of the bathroom, he switched on the newsfeed and set it for voice. Nothing interesting. Trade negotiations between the Scandinavian sector and the Russian sector. Dam announcing that it had developed and patented a new genetically modified wheat that was even better than the previous genetically modified wheat, and that would soon be available for purchase. Problems with drug smugglers 100 miles down the coast. A brief vid of a drifting empty boat, its deck slick with blood. The death of William Tanner, manager for Dredger Corp Chicxulub, formerly known as Ecodyne. Go back, he said. The hollow flipped back to the drug dealer story opened. Opened it up. No, he said. One later. William Tanner, manager of Dredger Corp Chicxulub, formerly known as Ecodyne, was found dead this morning, an apparent suicide. According to local police, his body was discovered at 9:30 this morning with his throat slit after Tanner failed to report to work at the Dredger Corp facility. A knife was found in his right hand. The police have not yet stated whether this knife was the instrument he used to kill himself. Though it is unusual for someone to commit suicide by slitting their own throat, it is not unheard of, said Sergeant Ramos. Though there is every indication that Mr. Tanner committed suicide, We cannot yet rule out the possibility of homicide. There has been a marked rise in suicides in Chicxulub and Everons over the last several weeks, including off, he said. The feed stopped. He sat heavily on the bed. One more thing to hold suspended in his head. Could be murder, could be suicide. He couldn't tell Ada about it. Not so soon after their fight. Not so soon after Hammond's death. It would just make her try to stop him. It's not that I'm lying to her, he told himself. I'm just trying to protect her. Ada climbed in beside him and he kissed her, feeling guilty the whole time. Then he turned off the lights and braced himself for the nightmares to begin. 30. Lenny Small, president of Dredger Corp, was still sleeping when the vidlink went active. He wasn't sure how much time had passed before he became aware of it. At first, he thought it was the maid talking on her phone, and he yelled, "For God's sakes, shut the hell up and get the hell out," putting the pillow over his head. "Wake up, Small," said a voice. It was a deep, gravelly voice, a certain edge to it. Definitely not the maid. Curious, he peeked out from under the pillow. The voice was coming from the hollow screen. "Oh, it's you, Markov," he said. "Damn right it's me," said the man on the screen. Craig Markov had white hair, slightly longer than a military man usually had, carefully combed back and gelled in place. He had an imposing, square-cut jaw and steady ice-blue eyes. He was wearing the dress uniform and insignia of government intelligence. As with all intelligent agents, his rank was not indicated even on his dress uniform. Small stretched. He moved to the edge of the bed and got out, naked, quickly slipping into his robe. Real silk, not synthetic. Because of environmental legislations, he had to smuggle it into North America's sector. This had cost him a small fortune, but damned if he could tell the difference. He looked out the penthouse window and sighed. "Can I wait until I have my coffee?" "Can I wait until I had my coffee?" he asked. "We have a situation. Tanner's dead." Instantly, Small was focused, his gaze alert. Mind sparking. How'd he die? Killed himself. Why? "I don't know," said Markov. "Guilt, perhaps?" "Not possible," said Small. "I've known that bastard for 20 years. He's handled much worse than this Chicxulub thing without batting an eye. You sure he wasn't killed?" "I'm certain," said Markov. "I had a camera installed in his room. He's just chatting away to himself and then he cuts his own throat. You can watch the vid of his death if you like." Small winced. "No thanks," he said. Markov shrugged. "Suit yourself. I have a script for you," said Markov. "Things that you can and can't say about his death. I want you to memorize it. Word for word? I've never been much good at memorization. It'll sound canned." The gist is fine," said Markov. "Put it in your own words." "Working with you is like making a deal with the devil," said Small. "No questions as to who's in charge." He waited, but Markov didn't say anything. "All right," Small said. "Send it over." Markov spun the script through the holoscreen. Small left it unopened. He'll deal with it later, after his coffee. "Anything else?" asked Small. "Or can I have my coffee now?" "One other thing," said Markov. "The signal pulse has stopped." "It stopped? What does that mean? What do we do?" "The gravity anomaly is still there. The object is still in place. It's just no longer signaling." "Do you think that it's broken? Maybe those two bastards damaged it when they went down there." "I don't think so," said Markov. "If that were the case, it would have stopped a few days ago, instead of now. No, I don't think that's it. Something else has happened, or it's made the decision to stop on its own. You talk about it as if it were sentient, said Small. It may be, said Markov. I'm sure it'll surprise us in more ways than one. You really think you can control it? I never meant anything I can't control, said Markov. Present company included. I don't see any reason to think this will be an exception. So, signal pulse or no, proceed as planned? Proceed as planned, said Markov. I'm having the station towed in position now. It's a slow process, but it'll get there. We can start on salvage operations for the submarine and take steps to prepare the object for extraction in the meantime. We still split the profits down the middle? Right down the middle, said Markov. But profits are hardly the point. 6 months from now, we may well be the two most powerful men in the world. He gave Small a cold smile. Think about that while you're drinking your coffee. 31. They ordered their beers at the counter and took them to a table in the back. All four of them. Showalter, Ramirez, Scud, and Altman. He was isolated enough that there was little danger of being overheard. It was isolated enough that there was little danger of being overheard, and from where they were sitting, Showalter and Ramirez could keep an eye on the front door. Scud and Altman on the back door. So it's gone, said Altman. The signal pulse has stopped? Scud made a face. I would not say it has stopped, he said. I would only say that perhaps it has stopped. Perhaps it has only become so attenuated as to be undetectable to our instruments. That's as good as stopped, said Ramirez. It has the same effect. But it is not the same thing, said Scud. All right, Scud, said Altman. Point taken. The first question is, what does it mean that we can no longer detect the signal? Nobody said anything. The anomaly is still there, said Altman. At least last I checked. Yes, said Showalter, it's still there. Sure, there's currently no signal, but it could simply be part of a larger pattern yet to be determined, said Scud. Well said, Scud, said Altman. So the signal has stopped. We don't know if this is permanent or temporary. We also don't know why. We may never know why, said Ramirez. Showalter and Scud began to argue with him in muted whispers. Altman waved his hand to silence them. The real question is, do we move forward now that the signal has died? The other three stared at him. What do you mean by move forward? Showalter asked. Until now, we've been investigating quietly, covering our tracks. Now Dredger Corp has made a public arrangement to dig down to the center of the crater, ostensibly to rescue their submarine. No doubt while they're there, they'll investigate whatever it is that lies at the heart of the crater. Scud made a non-committal grunt. Dredger Corp has come out into the open, or rather, they pretended to come out into the open. Is it time for us to do the same? What? Said Ramirez. What do you mean? You want us to knock on Dredger Corp's door and say, "Excuse me, we've been observing you and we don't think you're being entirely honest"? Sounds to me like a good way to get killed. I don't mean that, said Altman. I mean we go public. The four of us together write up a rigorous and well-reasoned proposal to the North American Sector Science Foundation to investigate the crater. We cite the gravity anomaly and the pulse signal. Perhaps even say something about the broadcast from the submarine. We call for a public government-sponsored excavation of the center of the Chicxulub crater. They sat together in silence for a moment, nursing their beers, except for Scud, who had almost immediately finished his. What if they say no? Said Showalter. Then we start approaching other granting organizations. We submit the proposal to as many places as possible. At once trying to get funding and trying to make sure that as many people as possible know about the pulse signal and the anomaly. Someone is sure to begin questioning Dredger Corp's motives. At the very least, they'll have to operate on a shorter leash. It could be like stirring up a nest of hornets, said Ramirez. Maybe, said Altman. We won't know until we start stirring. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe, God forbid, we will put ourselves in jeopardy. But maybe we'll find ourselves in a position to figure out what's at the bottom of that damned crater. He took a sip of his beer. Who is with me? The other three looked at one another. Scud was the first to raise his hand. I am with you, he said. Ramirez followed. Showalter hesitated for a long time and then finally nodded his head. Very good, gentlemen, said Altman. Let's get to work. Okay. That's the end of part 4. So, things are starting to pick up. We have various perspectives converging. Don't lose your voice. It's already going. Various perspectives starting to kind of converge onto each other. And I don't know, so I'm thinking of I'm about almost halfway through the book. Close to halfway. We're getting there. I actually do not know how many parts. I'm thinking, because all the numbers, I'm thinking those are actually the chapters, and then the parts are its own different separations. I really don't know. Because otherwise, I don't understand what is the point of the numbers. But either way, I'm going to end the set here. Just trying to determine how long the next chapter is. So used to saying sets. Either way, thank you for liking if you like. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys. See ya.